Hello, Marc. Welcome. Thank you so much for participating in this celebration of early Italian cello music and instruments. And I know that you're in Aspro, Italy, and maybe you could just briefly introduce yourself and some of your interests and passions.
Hi, Elinor. I'm glad to be here. I wish I had been there in person as planned, but given the situation, we have to do it remote. So my name is Marc Vanscheeuwijck, and I'm a Baroque cellist, and I teach musicology. Have been teaching musicology at the University of Oregon for 25 years or so.
Lucky student.
And well, don't know about that, but yeah.
So we're going to talk all about the early cello in Italy today. And you have some visuals and some things for us to listen to. So I'm just going to ask you some questions and you'll guide us through some of your ideas about how the cello came to be in Italy and some of its early repertoire and first performers, and all your insights about that. So the first thing that I want to ask you is, well, what is this Baroque cello today? And why do we need to sort of rethink it? And perhaps you can start by defining the cello or violoncello in this period, and especially in Italy, since that's our focus here.
Right. Well, first of all, we've been using this violoncello, this instrument that we basically all know, four-string, tuned in fifth, held between the legs with an end pin on the modern cello, with an overhand bow grip on the modern bow. And basically when in the 1960s, some of the first cellists interested in Baroque repertoire, I'm thinking, first of all, about Ander Bijlsma in Amsterdam, for instance, who was one of the pioneers, let's say, of the... when he started, he basically took the cello the way it was in its modern version, put gut strings on it, had, you know, different bridge, a different kind of bow, pretty much as the cello is described in the earliest method for cello that we have, which is by Michel Corrette and was published in Paris in 1740. But of course, in 1740, we're pretty much at the end of the Baroque period. Yeah. So basically what we've done with the cello, the historical cello, is pretty much go back to that 1740s instrument as described by Michel Corrette, and taken that also for the two preceding centuries, which are really what we're talking about when we talk about the Baroque period. So, you know, these periodizations are always a little bit arbitrary, and they're usually taken from art history. But for music, as far as we're concerned, you know, Baroque music, especially in Italy, can actually be defined to begin in the last quarter of the 16th century. So it's 1575, 1580. We traditionally started in 1600 because it's convenient, because as first opera, but there are, exactly. There are definitely, you know, enough aesthetic indicators to anticipate that with 25 years. And then we also use the death of Bach to sort of end it. And of course, Bach is already a little bit of an epigone who was refusing the later aesthetic developments, whereas we have people like Vivaldi and Handel who are moving into a more galant style as early as the 1720s and 1730s. So I tend to look at the Baroque period, especially in Italy, as something that sort of develops in 1570s, 1580s. And in Naples already, we're moving into full galant style in the 1720s. So that's pretty much the period I see the happening in. So when we talk about Baroque cello, we should actually talk about that period.
Yeah.
Exactly the period that starts with Michel Corret's description of what I think of as a new approach to the cello, which had come to Paris, especially through a number of Neapolitan players, one of the most important ones being Salvatore Lanzetti, who actually performed in Paris. And right after his performances at the Concert Spirituel in the early 1730s, we already see a big change in the way that French cellists compose their repertoire. I'm thinking here about Jean Barrière, for instance, who goes into a style that is more Neapolitan than French. And Michel Corret's treatise, his method book, his tutor, is really a method book that was intended for amateurs because it has the usual title that says Méthode pour apprendre en peu de temps et dans sa perfection. Le violoncelle, so in a short time and in its perfection. In 42 pages, of course, you don't teach an instrument. And in those days, people would, of course, learn with a teacher, whereas for amateurs, who were usually people of nobility, who had lots of times on their hands, they could actually, study by themselves from a method book. They could afford to buy it, which a professional musician usually could not. So it's a very different approach. And in there, he describes the cello the way we have been playing for the past 50 or 60 years in that neo-Baroque movement of the late 20th century, which is between the calves with overhand bow, four strings tuned in fifths, and that's pretty much it. So whereas even if we just to finish this, if we think about Italy in the 17th century, that too is not a unity as it has become since the 1860s with the unification of Italy. The reign of Naples, or the kingdom of Naples, was a vice kingdom that depended on from the Spanish government. But then we had the Papal States, which were their own unit. Then we had, of course, the Grand Duchy of Tuscany and the Republic of Venice, and so forth and so on. So we have all these areas which speak different languages, which have different cultures. So even when we talk about the Baroque cello in Italy, we still have to look at very small units, definitely smaller than Italy today. And I would even go further. When we see the complication or the perceived complication we have about terminology, we'll come back to that, because there's so many terms to denote the violoncello. We see that every region has its own uses. And for us, this might seem like different instruments, but sometimes you have 2 or 3 different words for one instrument. And sometimes, and that's more complicated, you have one term that in different regions denotes different instruments. So that's why basically we needed to go back into the pre-1740 period and go all the way back to the development of the string instruments, the bowed string instruments in families in general, as early as the late 15th century, to try to figure out what really happened in the 17th century. And it is not what we have been doing in the past 60 years.
Yeah, and it's really great work that you're helping us all discover. I know since meeting you, my whole world has changed. And if you can believe that was already 11 years ago. But I also just wanted to add to that, this Correct treatise was, he's trying to sell them, and some people who have the money are the gentlemen and merchants who are typically playing the quintessential French instrument, the viola da gamba. And he even, has a whole chapter saying, for those who want to learn to play the cello, but who already play the gamba, this is a way to do it. So, that was one thing, is sort of catching up the gambis on the new trend of this newer instrument of the cello, Italian cello. So maybe that helped sell his method book. Yeah.
Right. On the one hand, That is true. Although by then the viola da gamba in France had become pretty much of a virtuoso solo instrument that was played more often by professionals.
Yeah.
Of course, amateurs could always play basso continuo, but you know, the cello was an instrument that had been used in France, or at least the larger version of it, the basse de violon, and that was played by professionals in a variety of orchestras too. So Corrette is really addressing an audience of indeed nobility who are also interested in those new instruments that are coming from abroad, especially Italy, of course, because we're in the midst, or you know, the Querelle des Bouffons is about to happen when Corrette writes, and it's basically the Italians that win the quarrel, if you want. So everything Italian is really fashionable in a certain class of French society in the mid 18th century.
Yeah. So can you tell us a little bit about the sources of information about the violoncello or cello, and what do we have? Where do we get it? How do we know about this instrument? And for example, you know, some of the differences between the violas da gamba and the violas da braccio and the bass version of these families.
Right. So it's sort of a big question, but you know, keep me going for a bit.
Okay.
And maybe I'll show some things later of some images I put together in a PowerPoint, so you can see also what I'm talking about. Anyway, as I was saying about Michel Corrette, this is our first method book for the cello, and that's 1740, so basically past the Baroque period. Yeah. So we need to go look for something that is not a method book, and that complicates things because we have no one source printed or in manuscript that tells us this is a cello and here's how you play it and there's the music for it. We don't have anything like that. So we basically have to do what we traditionally do in you know, the world of historical performance practice, is pretty much take an approach where every source we can possibly find is worth considering. So we look at pictures. We call that iconography. Of course, you can't take any picture and the way it represents an instrument or the way it's played for granted. So there is a whole study, the study of iconology, which helps us understand what we can trust and what we need to question. But gathering enough visual information can help us get basically some statistics that we can use in posing some ideas about how to hold a bow, how the instrument can be held, what proportions are, and so forth. Then we have, of course, a lot of treatises that deal with music in general, and that always have, fortunately, a little appendix that tells us about instruments. Sometimes we get a scale with fingerings. Sometimes we get information about how to use the bow, how to hold it, or how to, you know, bow back and forth on what beats, you know, strong beats or weak beats. We also have, you know, any kind of chronicle or letter or any kind of documentation that can tell us how music was received, how people played, and so forth and so on. Then, of course, we have the repertoire itself, which rarely tells us what people did not know. That's the problem with original sources, is basically the composer will give you the minimal information you absolutely need, besides what you should already know. And of course, what we need to do today is try to figure out what did they know, you know, so that we can interpret those additional elements in a way that that is not anachronistic, and that, you know, when for instance, a classical example for music in general is when you see twice the same passage and the composer writes forte the first time and piano the second time, we tend to sort of generalize that and make every time we see twice the same musical phrase, we make it an echo. Well, no, an echo is something exceptional. It's something special. It's a special effect, basically. So if the composer writes it, that means that this is supposed to be a special effect. Where he would not write anything, you would probably do the opposite, or do what you do, reinforcing what you do in rhetoric. Why do you repeat yourself? Because you weren't understood well or correctly the first time. So you have to redo it. So, and so forth. So basically, treatises, letters, documents, archival documents, sorry, which can tell us what kind of instruments were used, who were the players, in what kind of ensembles, how many instruments would be used in a given situation, sacred music, secular music, chamber music, basically anything. So it's only by putting all these elements together that we end up figuring out what things can have been. Now, the biggest problem is the organology itself. That means the instruments. Even though we have all these Stradivari and Guadagnini and Amati and so many instruments so-called from the 17th or the 18th century, we have to be aware that, especially for Italy, we have virtually nothing left that is left untouched. I'm not saying that we don't have instruments that, you know, can honestly be called a Strad or an Amati or something like that. But every instrument of quality has obviously been adapted to the needs of the succeeding periods. And especially with the different needs, very different needs starting in the 19th century, instruments have been very drastically altered. You know, necks have been changed. The angle of the neck has been changed, the length even. So, you know, the pressure on the strings has been changed. The bridges have been changed. Inside, of course, they needed to adapt. They've thinned the top of a lot of instruments, changed the sound post. Of course, that's no big deal. But some really deep changes, profound changes have been made throughout the 19th century to all those old Italian instruments. So
and
if we just
in the false labels and the faking that happened too.
Well, of course, yeah. Obviously, there is all that. But if we have a piece of wood that is indeed, you know, from the 16th century or the 17th century, dendrochronology can give us that information. But that doesn't mean that those pieces of wood have not been assembled 2 centuries later and have, you know, created an instrument that is quite different. So dendrochronology is, you know, is part of a truth that is not necessarily the same truth as that of the actual instrument we have in our hands. And so their iconography can help us too. Again, if you amass enough iconography so that you can actually gather some information that seems to be recurrent. Of course, with 5 pictures, you won't make a case. You need 1,000 pictures to make a case and see what's going on there. And so to then attach this to your question about the differences between the viola da gamba and the viola da braccio, of course, we have the so-called leg viols, which we well know as the viola da gamba today, that comes in all kinds of sizes from soprano to great bass. And we have basically the same thing in the viola da braccio family. Of course, the viola da braccio are the instruments that are held on the arm, hence the term, the entire family. And of course, early on in the 16th century, when these instruments came about, the differences were probably, I think, a lot less a question of organological characteristics than they were a question of how you used the instruments. We have enough documentation that tells us that, for instance, at the court of Mantua, Isabella d'Este had her group of viole, that she had her builder and her dealer, you know, who dealt with makers in Venice. And at that point, we're in the very early 16th century. We have pictures from that period too. But in terms of shape and form, when we look at what today we call a viola da gamba and what we call a viola da braccio, so the violin family today, which are quite different in many organological characteristics, what we see in earlier iconography is much more of sort of an intertwining of the characteristics of those two families. So that's why I'm thinking that, you know, one of the first treatises, and I'm going to show you a few pictures here on the PowerPoint. I'm going to get a little earlier here. Let's see if I can, why is this not? Oh, we'll go back. Here we go. So this is a picture of the two, you know, engravings that Michael Pretorius gives us in his Syntagma Musicum of 1619, where he basically shows the two families right next to each other, and with the characteristics that we use today. So the viola da gamba has these, you know, upgoing shoulders, has 6 strings, has C-shaped sound holes, has frets, and so forth and so on. Whereas the violin family has these pointy corners, have F holes, have no frets, usually 4 strings, although the bass here has 5. And then, you know, a few more interesting details. This is pretty much, you know, by the beginning of the 17th century, we pretty much have a true, let's say, definitive shape for either one of these families. Whereas if we look earlier, as I said, we see that elements of both types of instruments appear in any kind, in any of these images. So in gathering, you know, hundreds, even thousands of images, what I noticed, and that's one of the things that brought me back to studying all of this about 15 years ago now, is that when I tried to find iconography, let's say from 1500 to 1800, just limited to those 3 centuries, I realized that instruments that would really characterize or qualify, I would say, as viola da gamba, pure viola da gamba, as represented by Pretorius, and as we can see all these instruments in museums, that these would represent maybe 20% of 15 or 20% of what I had. Wow. Same thing for the pure violin family instruments, would also be another 20, 25%. So basically less than half of all the iconography I had from these 3 centuries would be pure examples of either one of these families, whereas more than half was actually what I would call hybrids, because they showed characteristics of both. Of course, there's always the possibility that the painter did not really know what he was doing, but we also know that most painters had instruments in their shops and were copying them pretty faithfully when needed. Sometimes they went from memory, and then you can see some weird things that make no sense, either organologically or in terms of playing. Sometimes a painter would make a quick sketch and then develop the painting, you know, on the canvas itself. But it's striking to see that in most of the 16th century, we have typically instruments that show characteristics of both. And so what I got interested in was to try to figure out why this was. And here in Philibert Jean de Fer's Épitome Musical, treatise from Lyon, that was published in 1556, he actually makes a difference between the 2 families of instruments. That is almost exclusively a question of who plays them and what the purpose is. So he says, nous appelons violes celles desquelles les gentilshommes marchands et autres gens de vertu passent leur temps. So it's basically the people of quality, gentlemen and merchants and people of virtue play the viols. L'autre sorte s'appelle violon. So the other kind is the violin, et c'est celui duquel on use en danserie communément et à bonne cause. And then he talks a little bit about the fact that the violin is easier to tune because the fifth is easier to hear and it's easier to carry, which is chose fort nécessaire même en conduisant quelques noces ou momeries. So basically, the violin is an instrument that needs to be playable while moving. Whether you are basically leading a wedding or some, carnival event, but you can also think of situations that are definitely liturgical, where you have processions. And if you don't have the cornetto and sackbut ensemble, as we can see in many examples in iconography, the famous ommegang in Brussels, for instance, in the 15th century, 16th century, you see violin family instruments being played, and the same thing when there is a big festivity in Venice. There are paintings by Giovanni Bellini that show violins too. So basically, if you sit down, if you are a person of nobility, you sit down, you play an instrument and you call it viola da gamba. If you stand up and you pick up the same instrument, but since you have to walk with it and you either hang it on your, from your neck or you put it on your shoulder, then you call it violin or viola da braccio. And so that may explain why the organological differences are not as striking in the 16th century, because it was just a question of use. Also, what we know is that viols being played, or viola da gamba being played by people of nobility, were played seated.
Yeah.
Whereas professional musicians were often of a much lower social class and were usually put in a balcony somewhere or were in movement. And so they were most of the time actually standing also, because in the company of nobility, they were not supposed to be sitting down. So the instrument needed to be gradually adapted to a kind of way of playing it that was, standing, that was in motion. And so knowing that, when we sort of reconsider the iconography, we can figure out a few elements. And then when we see those hybrids, this is...
Oh, sorry.
Say that again?
I was just saying it's a really different perspective. And when you have that perspective, it changes how you look at all the iconography. It's really interesting. Yeah. Yeah,
completely. So if you see this instrument, of course, this is an engraving that was copied from a painting. And here you see an instrument that, in terms of the shape of the case, has characteristics of a viola da gamba, but then, and also it has frets. But then on the other hand, it has 4 strings, and it has F-shaped or S-shaped holes. Now, of course, the painter or the engraver here didn't really understand the function of a bridge. So it's on the outside of the F holes, which is a little absurd. But I think some of these characteristics, as we'll see in other paintings, and of course, I can only show you a short anthology of images, not the whole thing. It will take days. But when you see that kind of element recurring, coming back all the time, it means something for the reality of things too. Another, some of the earliest images we have here is Gaudenzio Ferrari's ceiling of the Santa Maria dei Miracoli in Saronno. Musical angels. It's basically a whole dome. The inside of the dome is completely painted. This is just a detail. And we see instruments here too, some of which are probably celestial instruments and sort of are not supposed to look like earthly instruments. But when we see that little bass instrument, it definitely has characteristics of a cello, if you want, a bass violin. It's a lot smaller if you look at the proportion with the angel. He holds the bow also typically overhand, but with the pinky under the stick. So that's an important detail, because we see that even described in treatises in the early 17th century. But then the bottom part of the instrument is that of a gamba. So we basically have the two instruments sort of, put together in one. Here too, Pomponio Amalteo in northeastern Italy. We have a large instrument here, which seems to have 5 strings with overhand bow hold, has sort of a lot of characteristics of a viola da gamba, but has the frets, has the C holes, but then it has the corners where the bow hand is, that are typical of the violin family. So here too, we have not that so clear definition that we would get later with the after the treatise of Pretorius and continuing into the 17th century. Here's another picture of Johannes Sadler, which is again an engraving after a painting by Pieter de Witte, done in Antwerp in the late 16th century. Technically already the early Baroque period. We have an instrument here again that has the shape of a big cello with F holes, but then it has 5 strings indeed, and it has frets, and then the bow that is held underhand. I'll come back to that because until very recently, the underhand bow hold has been solely attributed to gambists. And now we know that it was actually the normal way of holding the bow, which survived late into the 18th century, as you know very well, with Antonio Vandini. This is another thing that was part of that reconsideration and is based in iconography, because few treatises talk about how to hold the bow in the 17th century on the bass instruments of the violin family.
It's also interesting to see where he holds the bow, where the gamba players typically hold up on the hair these days. And so looking at all these different pictures, there's many places where the hand is placed. Yeah.
Yeah, and of course, one picture, again, wouldn't tell us the whole truth. But once we start seeing 50 or 80 or 100 pictures that show the same thing, there might be something to that, right? So it's, here's another instrument by, in the Annunciation by El Greco, which shows pretty much the same characteristics. One thing that is quite typical too is that very low position of the bridge, well under the F holes. Of course, in this period, we have no wire wound gut strings yet. We only have pure gut strings. And so, in order not to have bass strings that are too thick, you want to have as much length as you possibly can. And if you don't want to go around with a huge sound case, like a double bass, you can actually lower the bridge. And this seems to have been quite normal in the 17th century. Even violins had very low bridge positions, except maybe instruments in Cremona, but all the other violin schools in Italy have these low bridge positions, which, help us make good sound on an instrument that is not too large, so that we have a maximized string length, because that's really what it's about. See, I can show you plenty more pictures. Here's something that really looks like a bass violin. Again, has all the characteristics of that instrument, only has 6 strings, and is held here on the floor and played by a woman of nobility. So is it the viola da gamba? Is it the viola da braccio? According to the function, this is a viola da gamba. But if I were to play the same instrument held with a strap hanging from my shoulder and in procession, it would become a viola da braccio, a basso da braccio. And this is true for a lot of instruments during the 16th and even early 17th century. Here's another interesting one. Looks like almost like a gamba, the way it's played. It has the upgoing shoulders, but everything else is like a cello, only it has 6 pegs. So it looks like it's a gamba, so it could be 6 strings. But then we see 2 little pegs on my right side, so on the player's left side. And then we see that the instrument actually has 8 strings. So it's an 8-string bass instrument, which means that with these 2 little strings, you can play really high. which would be
Wow.
probably the perfect instrument for the repertoire that we call today the viola bastarda repertoire, which is a repertoire that goes from the lowest to the highest registers, you know, throughout all the parts of a polyphonic texture that is at the origin of what the player would be diminishing or varying or playing ornamentations upon.
So why don't you tell us
Um,
a little bit about this repertoire in the early 17th century, and that could lead into saying a little bit about the repertoire in Bologna, and maybe could you also explain whether the cello is it really born in Bologna, or is it sort of from Naples? So let's get into the repertoire,
yeah.
but keep going
Yeah.
in your own flow as well. Yeah.
Before we get into the repertoire, I'll get there eventually. We still need to look at, you know, and this is why I'm now zooming in on the viola da braccio family as it develops then in the later 16th century and becomes more recognizable to us as those cellos. Now, of course, the terminology tricks us a little bit because the term violoncello is a term that appears for the first time in 1665 in a print by Giovanni Battista, by Arresti, actually, in Bologna, in a print that, you know, we only have the base part book of in the university library in Wrocław in Poland. And it's not Giovanni Battista Arresti, I'm sorry, it's Giulio Cesare Arresti, who was an organist in San Petronio in Bologna and published these sonatas for 2 violins and un violoncello a beneplacito. So a cello part if you want, because it just doubles the basso continuo. And that's the first occurrence of the term violoncello. So we're in 1665. And yet we have all these pictures of instruments. So I'm showing you here this picture of a family of instruments that comes not from the Cremona school or any Italian school, but from the so-called Alemannische Schule, which is a violin making tradition that pretty much is geographically located between Strasbourg on the Rhine and Basel on the Rhine, with some builders who worked all the way east to Zurich in that southern part. So it's basically the Black Forest around the Rhine there in Germany and France and Switzerland. So these instruments are all from the late 17th century, and typically we have the violin, the alto viola, the tenor viola, and then we have 2 basses, a smaller and a larger bass. The larger bass is actually a little bigger than the modern cello, and the smaller bass is actually a little smaller than the modern cello. And so with that in mind, I've been trying to look again at iconography and at terminology, because in many places, like in Venice, but also in Naples, the regular term for the bass instrument of the violin family was viola. No more, no less. Some people will want to be a little more precise and will call it basso viola. Some people will even, like Monteverdi, be very precise, and also because he uses viola da gamba and viola da braccio, for instance, in Orfeo, he will say basso di viola or basso viola da braccio or da braccio, whereas he will talk about basso viola da gamba to make the difference. So viola was actually the normal term for a bass violin in the 17th century. So for the bass instrument of the violin family. And then sometimes, of course, we see the alto instrument being called alto viola and the tenor instrument being called tenore viola. And then the little viola was the violino. So to make, when we start seeing a repertoire that develops for 1 violin and basso continuo, like the sonatas by Cima, Giovanni Paolo Cima, who publishes basically the first sonata for violin and cello and continuo in 1610 in Milan, publishes, doesn't mean These pieces didn't exist before. But in his sonata for violino, he opposes a violone, so a big viola. And so basically violone in some areas becomes the regular term for the bass instrument of the violin family. But then in some situations, like in the sonatas by Castello, Dario Castello was cornetto player in Venice, and Giovanni Battista Fontana, who published, well, actually he didn't publish, it was published for him after 10 years after he died of the plague in Venice in 1630. So Fontana, of Fontana, there is a collection of music, instrumental music for violins and wind instruments and all sorts of things that was published in 1641, and it has parts for violoncino. So a little violone. Now, just like limoncino and limoncello, the ino and the ello is just a diminutive, and the different uses of it does not denote anything different in terms of you know, what that liqueur is. It's just a local variation of using a diminutive. So violoncino, violoncello makes no difference between the two. Thing is, in the north, ino is more current as a diminutive, and we see that these northern Italian composers, when they really want a small type of a bass violin, they will call for a violoncino or a bassetto viola, as they do in Bologna. And then if we go back to the 16th century violin bands in Venice that were developed already in the 1520s, we see that a lot of these ensembles had actually 5 or 6 instruments. So a smaller violin, also called sometimes a falsetto, the violino, the alto viola, tenore viola, and then we have the bassetto and the basson in Venetian. So the little bass and the big bass, sometimes called violoncino and violone. And so that brought me basically on the track to again reconsider iconography and look at the music and so forth. And I realized that basically we have in the bass violin group, we have 2 separate families, if you want. The smaller ones called bassetto, violoncino, and later violoncello, and the larger ones called basso or violone or violoncellone, I've even seen, and so forth and so on. So basically for the Baroque period, we don't have that one standardized cello that Corrette describes, which is actually an ideal compromise between the Baroque bass instruments that were either smaller than the modern cello or larger than the modern cello, with different functions and obviously different tunings too. So that sort of brings me gradually to the repertoire because we have music that really calls for violoni, and we have music that calls for violoncino or bassetto, or after 1665, violoncello. So I'll just quickly show you a few of these instruments. You know, whoever watches this can always, you know, stop the video and look at them longer. This is a 5-string instrument. I have to say too that the bass violins, whether small or large, so whether violoncello or violone, I'll call them this way for henceforth, could have 4 strings or 5 strings, and sometimes even 6, especially the larger types. So a 4-string bass, a 5-string bass, a 6-string bass, they can all be bass violins.
I mean,
so here you see
Brossard in his dictionary in 1703 says the violoncello has 5 or 6 strings, which is fascinating.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. And you know, the violone too, you know, violone is also a term that they use in Italian in the 16th century to denote viola da gamba family instruments. So all that confusion, of course, has everything to do with the fact that the instruments themselves were not nearly as separate as we tend to see them today, but that differentiation was made primarily on their use rather than their organological characteristics. So I can also start pointing out a few elements of position of the instruments, which we will get into later. Here, the instrument is clearly on the floor, not between the calves as today, with an underhand bow hold. Here we have, famous painting, the Santa Cecilia by Carlo Saraceni, which is in the Palazzo Barberini in Rome. Something that looks exactly like a cello, only it has 6 strings, and it is proportionally to the theorbo that's right next to it, probably a violone rather than a violoncello. And we do have, of course, tunings for that kind of instrument, which is the same as what we have come to call in the 21st century the G violone, which is a smaller double bass, if you want, or what I would call a 12-foot bass. So it's basically halfway between the 8-foot low C of the cello and the 16-foot lower C of the larger double bass today, because lowest string is actually a G, hence G violone. So I'm just to get started with a little bit of music, a little bit of repertoire, I'll play Bruno Coxet, who was going to be in Montreal too, but here is a recording he did of a little piece that uses that bass violin in 6 strings, and then I'll come back to the composer when I'll show you a little list of pieces that just play the beginning of it, so that you can hear the full extension of the instrument. So it's really almost like a viola bastarda. Here we go.
Great.
And so forth. So,
Incredible.
If you think that there was no real virtuoso repertoire for bass violins, this shows you the opposite. These are actually diminutions alla bastarda, they go through all the parts, of a number of chansons or motets by 16th century composers, diminutions that are written by Vincenzo Bonizzi and published in 1628. So this is already part of that violone repertoire. Therefore, basso, they go to the very low G. So this is a perfect instrument for that. Now, on the other hand, we have a bunch of instruments that seem to be playing bass parts because they accompany higher instruments and that are quite small. So here you can see strumenti piccoli, so violoncino, violoncello, smaller instruments held vertically, however the player wants. That's another thing actually, that we've become so thinking that we are purists in the late 20th, early 21st century by holding the cello in one precise way. What we see in iconography is actually an enormous variety of holding the instrument and holding the bow, depending on areas, depending on times, depending on the person, you know. So there's a lot of flexibility. So that's one of the things that all this research has offered me too, is, you know, being able to be a lot more flexible and a lot less standardized, which is really a quality of the Enlightenment, that standardization idea, which develops in the second half of the 18th century.
I think it's
Anyway,
a lot
a few
more
pictures.
fun too.
Yeah. So here are a few pictures of smaller instruments. A lot of iconography, of course, is Dutch. Cornelis Cornelisson van Haarlem here, early 17th century. It's actually a 4-string instrument. You see the bow hold, it's held on the feet, and it's a tiny little instrument. And just in case, you know, we would think, oh, that can't be tuned like a cello. Well, it wasn't. And here we have Adriano Banchieri to help us with this. And we see in the left column, Concerto di Viole da Gamba, and the prima viola basso is actually the low G violone. You see a bass clef on the 6th line, if you want, which shows that lowest note to be a low G. And then we have a bass clef on the 5th line. And then the next one is a C. And then we have the regular bass clef for the 3rd string, which is basically our F, and so forth. And then you have the tenor and alto, always tuned in the same way, and the soprano gamba, which is also in G, not the French gamba in high D. So that's why they were called violoni, because they were basically, the viola da gamba were the larger group of instruments. The viola da braccio were the smaller. And if you look at the prima violetta basso of the Concerto di Violette da Braccio in the right column, you see that the tuning here is G, D, A, E. Basically the same tuning as the violin, but an octave lower. And that was considered the base of the violin family. So that also explains, if you want a lower bass than that, you sort of have to dig into the other family and get, you know, a G violone of the bass of the viola da gamba family. So the two were so intertwined that this habit we have today of seeing the viola da gamba and the viola da braccio as completely separate entities was definitely not part of the reality, at least of early 17th century Italy. And then you see the second one, the violette, tenor and alto. These were tuned in C, G, D, A, just like the modern instrument, and also typical, even though the alto was smaller than the tenor, the two were tuned in the same way. The tenor being longer, you know, had better sound on the lower strings and could play a different lower part. Whereas the violino del concerto è solo. So the violin is even mentioned as a possible solo instrument rather than a consort instrument, as the violin family was born as a consort anyway. But we see that the violin here is tuned just like the modern violin, G, D, A, E. So an octave higher than the bass. And so this too is basically a bass instrument of the violin family. Whether we tune it with 5 or 6 strings in that very low range we just heard, or we tuned it a fifth higher than the modern cello, we're still in the family of the bass instruments. So basically being a Baroque cellist does not mean anymore to play one instrument, but play a whole slew of them: 5-string, 6-string, 4-string, in C, in low G, in B flat, as in France, in the octave below the violin, G, and then of course 4- and 5-string varieties of all these instruments are also an option. So it really, you know, being a Baroque cellist means that you can play all these different instruments, which is a whole lot more fun than just being stuck with one. And then we see that once that one instrument becomes the standard, then people start to develop a type of virtuosity that is very different from the virtuosity of the Baroque period, which has, you know, more of a flexibility of different instruments, different tunings, different numbers of strings, different ways of holding the bow. Whereas once we basically focus in, zoom in on one instrument, we start developing, you know, something that has more to do with developing the higher registers and making more complications in terms of articulation and bowing. And so the virtuosity sort of changes focus completely. So here you see a few instruments. I'll quickly go through them. Yeah. Yes, go ahead.
I was just going to say, and it also follows a lot of what was happening with the violin.
Yeah, exactly. And the violin was one of the instruments that, you know, got standardized first in the violin family. You know, by the beginning of the 17th century, the violin is pretty much what it is a century later or 2 centuries later. Whereas the cello was the second instrument in the family to standardize. Basically, by the 1730s, we get this, you know, middle compromise instrument between the violoncello or the bassetto or the violoncino and the violone. And then the viola, never even standardized. We still have different sizes, you know, even though the tenor part was sort of abandoned in Italian music in the late 17th century and in French music a little bit later. The cant, the violon, is abandoned, you know, only in the 1740s, if you want. And the double bass is still not standardized, not even organologically. It still has characteristics of both the violin and the viola da gamba family. The tunings in fourths, which is typical for the gamba. So the double bass still has ways to go if it, you know, aims at being standardized anytime soon. But the cello was the first instrument after the violin to start, as you say, imitating the repertoire of the violin in this solo, virtuoso, Paganini-like literature that already develops in the middle of this 18th century once the instrument is standardized with people like Boccherini, but even before with Lanzetti, with the Neapolitans. And, you know, I still have in mind your question about, was it born in Bologna or Naples? I'm getting to that too. So here you see smaller instruments too, opera rehearsal here in Florence. And here, you know, an instrument played standing. The instrument could be played standing too. Bach uses that instrument. Sometimes he calls it violoncello. Sometimes he calls it violoncello piccolo to make sure that they use it. Nowadays, we call violoncello piccolo that instrument that has 5 strings, which is basically an anachronism. It's a bit of an absurdity because a violoncello is already piccolo. It's already a small bass violin. So by making it an even smaller violoncello, how small does it need to be, right? So, and violoncelli had, even in these very small sizes, both 4 and 5 strings. And it's for a 5-stringing instrument that Bach wrote his 6th cello suite, probably around 1725 or 26. And here, I'll play you a little excerpt from one of his cantatas, where the violoncello part is really meant for an instrument with 4 strings, tuned like Banchieri's instrument in G, D, A, E, so it has a high E string. Most people today play that piece on a 5-string cello, but Bach never uses the low string. And so there is no need for a 5-string instrument to play this. It's just the beginning of cantata, of one of the chorales of cantata BWV number 6. Again, Bruno Coxet here playing a small bass instrument tuned G, D, A, E. And so forth and so on. In the museums, we still have quite a few of these instruments here. The Germanisches Nationalmuseum in Nuremberg has a lot of these tiny little instruments with 4 and 5 strings. And of course, they haven't been modernized or haven't been used much since the second half of the 18th century. And so, you know, they were not really attractive for the market. Some of them have been cut back to violas or tenors, but a lot were left the way they were. And that's why we have a bunch of these still left in the museums, because, you know, once they go out of use, either they throw them in the fireplace, or they put them in a Wunderkammer, in a glass box to be admired by visitors. You know, that's pretty much what happens to them. And therefore, and again, a 5-string instrument here. Quite a few of them actually in Germany. So this is sort of the instrument we can imagine for these violoncello or so-called violoncello piccolo parts in Bach's cantatas and elsewhere. And of course, even Quantz in 1752 still tells us that, you know, wer auf dem Violoncell nicht nur akkompagniert, sondern auch Solo spielt, tut sehr wohl, wenn zwei besondere Instrumente hat. So basically, a cellist who doesn't only play accompaniment, that means orchestra or continuo, but also plays solo, needs to have 2 instruments. I won't read you the whole text here, but basically he says, a smaller instrument for solo and a larger instrument for Ripienspielen, for playing ripieno in large ensembles by großen Musikern. And then he gives some details even about differences in bows and differences in color of bow hair. On a small instrument, you use a light bow with white hair, and a large instrument, you use a heavy bow with black hair, and so forth and so on. So a professional cellist in the 18th century was supposed to still have 2 instruments, a small one for solo and a large one for orchestra, basically a violoncello and a violone. Quantz, of course, works in Berlin. The standardization that we see appearing in Paris in the 1740s has not necessarily happened in Germany. So they're not basically deciding yet to have one single instrument. And in Germany, we see the variety of instruments and older playing techniques surviving a lot longer than in Paris. Mm-hmm. And that all brings me to basically Bologna again. You've heard me talk a lot about Naples, saying it's the Neapolitan cellists in Paris who basically, you know, introduced the cello and helped its standardization. On the other hand, when we read the available literature, we see, oh, the cello is born in Bologna. Why? Because, well, the word is born in Bologna, or in the music of a Bolognese composer, even though it was published in Venice. And then, more importantly, the earliest cello pieces that say violoncello solo are by Bolognese composers. Actually, some of them Bolognese, some of them from Modena, but they often worked either in San Petronio together or at the courts of Francesco II d'Este in Modena. And these are Domenico Gabrielli, who wrote us the very earliest solo pieces for cello, the Ricercari, 7 of them, a canon for 2 cellos, and also a couple of sonatas, each in 2 versions. Often we've thought that the Ricercata of 1687 by degli Antoni were the earliest, but you know, there is a violin part, so these are duets, not solo pieces, even though in the print we only have the cello part.
And we found this out thanks to your work, so thanks again.
You're welcome. There is a manuscript in Modena which has a violoncello and a violin part. Yeah. And you know, this pedagogical repertoire for violin and cello, or for treble and bass instrument, was very, very diffuse, very common in the late 17th century. So degli Antoni is no exception to that. But at the court of Modena, we have a few Modenese composers like Giuseppe Colombi and Giovanni Battista Vitali, who have left us manuscripts that are now in the Biblioteca Estense in Modena, and that are pieces for solo bass. And they're not pieces to be performed in concerts. They're little teaching tools to teach basically the player to ornament upon a ground. You know, we have a bergamasca, we have a ruggero, we have a bunch of chaccone, basically, that exactly, that the composer gives us a set of variations, basically to teach the player, which was in this case probably Francesco II himself, who was a dilettante on the violin and the cello and has had his teachers who left them music to play, because, you know, that's typical for the amateur. They don't compose what they play, they don't improvise what they played written music. And so this is the earliest repertoire we have for the solo cello. But in Bologna, we have still at that time a great variety of types of instruments, smaller ones, the violoncello, larger ones, the violoni. And what we know is that they were played in all kinds of positions, whether standing, strapped at the shoulder vertically, whether seated, usually on the floor. They could, in small spaces, like a cantoria of a church, you know, usually small churches, where you don't have much depth in the balcony before, you know, hitting the organ, you can't basically sit down and play the instrument as we do it today.
Can you show us a picture? If there's a picture.
Yeah, I can. I'll go through the PowerPoint here. So you have a bunch here, for instance, we have a typical hold of the bass, or let me show you a few more here. Standing on the floor mostly. Here too. Oh, nice. Here you have bass instruments. So that's a typical picture of a situation in Bologna, where musicians are in very narrow balconies, where it's impossible to actually sit down and play the instrument. So you just flip it around and let it sit on the balcony, as you can see here, and then play it like this. For us, that seems odd, because, you know, for a cellist to start playing like a violin, your world changes, you know, it's unless you've been trained. But these musicians were trained as string players, so they played all the instruments in the family. So like a Bononcini brothers, you know, Giovanni or Antonio Maria, they were hired as violinists, and when needed, they played a cello part or a viola part and switched instrument and could play it in any old kind of position. But what is typical is that all these instruments that we see being played horizontally and playing the bass part are actually quite large instruments. They're not those little things that we've ended up calling violoncello da spalla. You know, don't know if we will have time to get into that, but all these instruments that are held horizontally basically are large instruments, and were only played in that position when either the space was not sufficient to play vertically, or when, as we saw in, here's another picture, also in Bologna, already later in this 18th century, 1747. Don't know if I have, would make us go back a little further. You see all these instruments. Notice the underhand bowing in so many situations. There's Vandini, also with underhand bowing. Here a few overhand bow grips, as described by Michel Corrette here. But this picture here by Ghirardini, Bologna 1730s, there's another situation where you could say, well, there is enough space, but often, you know, when the harpsichordist had the score, nobody else had parts. So everybody was reading basically from the harpsichordist and standing around her or him and try to see what they were playing. So it's easier to put the instrument on your shoulder to play an easy bass line. It wouldn't be that easy to play a cello suite on a regularly sized instrument like that. And the thing is, we don't have pictures of smaller instruments of which we can say they're playing a bass part. These smaller instruments are thus most probably tenors or altos, what they would call violette. So going back to...
What you're saying reminds me of how many people would first have a job playing one instrument, and then maybe their second big job came playing another. So for example, Evaristo, I should say, the father of Giuseppe Clemente, who everybody's interested these days,
Right.
first played cello in Modena, and but then was later known as a violinist, and then of course composer. And even Bach had a job as a violinist, and then later keyboard player. And so it's not like you choose your instrument at age 8 and then don't touch another one till you die, like today what happens. So
no, and it was typical whether you worked as a Stadtpfeife or Kunstpfeife in Germany, or whether you learned your instrument in one of the conservatori in Naples, or learned at a cathedral school or a collegiate church school. You basically learn to sing, you learn a keyboard instrument because you need to learn how to play continuo, and you compose at the keyboards, using partimenti in the 18th century or whatever. And then you typically also play an instrument. And by one instrument, they usually mean a family of instruments. So you play all the brass, you play all the woodwinds, and you play all the bowed strings too. If you're a lute player, you also play theorbo, you play chitarrone, you play guitar. Well, there is an issue of nails too there. But if you are a professional string player, bowed string player, you play all the instruments in the family of the violin, and that was normal. We can't fathom that today, but back then it was absolutely the norm. So it's absolutely no problem to play, up or down for a cellist. They could do it all, and their careers usually develop in ways in which those instruments change, the needs change. And one month they're paid as a violinist, and the month after that as a tenor viola player, and then the third month as a violone player. Same person. That was sort of normal. Whereas in Naples, we don't have the kind of solo repertoire in the late 17th century. All this music I was talking about with Gabrielli, Vitali, and so forth, that's probably late 1670s. Gabrielli is 1689. Domenico Galli is 1691. But in Naples, we see a very different situation. Our first repertoire for solo cello is Supriani, and that already takes us into the 17 teens or 20s even. And then, all the great virtuosos. But what we see too is that through the Conservatori in Naples, all these musicians, as I just mentioned, played all the instruments of the family, and were often trained by violinists. So for instance, late 17th century, we don't have a cello teacher in Naples. We have Caillot, was probably of French origin, Caillot, who teaches people like Supriani, who becomes a cellist. So in the iconography that we have of Naples, and there is not a whole lot of it, but all the iconography we see, and here is an example, the bow is held overhand. And when we see those Neapolitan cellists move to Paris or to London, in 1707, the Austrians basically take over the kingdom of Naples. And so a lot of people leave, emigrate, and go work in England. And then when the Spaniards come back in 1734, we have the opposite current, in the sense that everybody who was a little too Austrian oriented decides it's maybe a good time, politically speaking, to take off. And so then we get a lot of people in the 1730s, musicians moving to France, moving to Paris, and starting their careers there. And so Lanzetti is definitely someone who started in Naples, worked for the Savoyas in Torino, went to play in London, ended up in Paris for a long time. And he is one of those virtuosos who, in France, I think, inspired Corrette to write his method. So if we think about...
I just want to add to the Jean-Baptiste Stuck, who's from Livorno, first
Mhm.
went to Naples and then from Naples to Paris. And I think in that first wave around 1703.
Right.
So
Exactly.
has a kind of Austrian name, or German name, but is an Italian who then became a French cellist, really one of the first great French cellists. So just
Yeah,
to
absolutely.
yeah.
No, Stuck, of course, of Stuck, we don't have any cello music. We only have a bunch of cantatas
Yeah.
and operas. But
Great music.
yeah, he was definitely one of these people who went to France and who, maybe turned performers like Barrière to this new repertoire. Berthaud, especially, who was a gambist, who seems to have met Cipriani, and then based on that, decided to switch to the cello. Of course, these are legends that we can't. Francischiello, yeah, Francesco Alborea, yeah, that's the person he met. Little Francis and Francischiello, which is a diminutive in Neapolitan. Anyway, all these people ended up in France. And when we're thinking today about the origin of the cello as we have known it since Corrette, so basically of the classical cello, that means of the modern cello, then the direct line to Paris, where that cello as we know it today has developed, comes from Naples.
Yeah.
So if we're trying to think where was the cello born? Well, everywhere in the Italian peninsula. But if we are thinking about the way the classical and this modern cello developed, that comes directly out of Naples through London and Paris to us. Whereas the repertoire for solo cello first appears in Bologna, but it is a slightly different instrument. It's either larger or smaller, and it's played rigorously with underhand bowing, because that was one of the characteristics of the Neapolitans, although they often had smaller cellos than a modern instrument, but they play overhand, just like the musicians at the Chapelle Royale in Versailles, because Lully had imposed that. So we already have that French tendency of playing overhand, with overhand bow grip, and then that's reinforced by the Neapolitans, whereas most of the rest of Europe actually plays the cello underhand, as you've seen in some of the pictures I quickly went through before. And now that we know all that, we can start talking a little bit about repertoire, but go ahead.
I was just going to say, you could stop sharing your screen quickly, because I think I wanted to just put myself back on the screen.
I will stop sharing.
Yeah. Yeah. So that leads me, and I don't know if this is a good moment, but we can go back and forth, to want to ask you about this new book. These two new books, I think, that are related to what you just talked about. One is about the cello in Naples, and then the other is about the Bononcini family, because I find this character of Giovanni Bononcini is one that kind of weaves through the whole, every side, because he's from Modena and worked in Bologna, and then also was in Rome and Naples, but we know he was in Paris and spent a couple years in Berlin, and of course more famously long time in London. And so what about him? I mean, he's everywhere, and he's the most famous, it seems, one of the most famous, and really influences a lot of people. So maybe this is a good moment to talk about this particular cellist that seems to weave throughout all these stories.
Sure. Yeah, this Bononcini book actually came out very recently and was the result of a conference that was held in Modena in 2016, I think 4 years ago. In any case, the title is Da Modena all'Europa. So basically, Bononcini, the brothers Bononcini, Giovanni and Antonio Maria, the two sons of Giovanni Maria, who was a musician at the court in Modena, actually what started their careers in Bologna, in San Petronio, especially Giovanni. Vienna, as you mentioned, Berlin, London, Paris, even Spain and Portugal before he came back to Modena. So we really have a one of those itinerant composers who was a violinist, but ended up focusing more on the cello, but wrote operas and oratorios and cantatas, and so did Antonio Maria. So basically, we decided to do a conference to sort of get the studies about the Bononcinis a little bit back underway, because they seem to have stalled a little bit in the 1990s. There were articles here and there, but it was sort of a moment to stimulate that. And for me, it was particular interest because both Bononcinis are cellists, and my contribution to that was basically trying to figure out what instruments did they play. What is the cello of the Bononcinis? And it is, again, not a question you can answer with, well, this was the instrument. There's a lot of possibilities, and 4-string and 5-string instruments, and mostly of the small sorts, because they really use violoncello and work mostly as solo players. Did they play overhand, underhand? Most probably underhand. In that Bolognese, Modenese tradition, even though they also played violin, they could have played both. We don't really have pictures of either of them playing that instrument. We have a few sonatas by both of them. Those of Antonio Maria are a bit puzzling because they seem to have all these repeating chords, and then this very complicated
black double stop chords in 16th. It's it's shocking almost.
Yeah. Although I think it's not a type of sonata that is meant to be played in concert. These are, again, pedagogical pieces that I think are meant for the cellist to learn how to play continuo. Because we know more and more now about the realization of basso continuo by cellists, which was not necessarily done by chords, but often by arpeggiating, and sometimes a combination of both if no harpsichord was available. And when you look at those chords, those continuous, fast batteries of notes, you realize, they're just a harmonization of the bass line. There's no melody there whatsoever. So maybe they can be seen as pieces like that. There's a lot of recent scholarship that has dealt with that. There's an article by Giovanna Barbati that is really, enlightening on that. John Lutterman has written on that too. There are more and more publications that actually address that problem. The other hand of Giovanni Bononcini, we have 2 sonatas, maybe a third one that is an attribution in a publication in London in the 1740s. But the other 2 sonatas have recently been, they were found in a manuscript in Monte Cassino, and Guido Olivieri has just published them in a good modern edition. Lowell Lindgren, on the other hand, had published the 14 sonatas of Antonio Maria. But the most interesting thing, I think, in both Bononcini's music, are the solo cello arias in the oratorios or the serenate. In the operas, very little, but in the oratorios are just gorgeous solo cello parts, and they really work best on a 5-string cello. So I'm pretty convinced that in that kind of music, underhand bowing, 5-string cello, probably tuned with a high string, not at the 5th above the A string, but at the 4th, because that's probably the more common tuning. Also, given that Bach asks in his cello suite for 5 strings and gives the tuning in 5ths, I think that's an indication that it's a rather unusual tuning. If you tune an instrument with 5ths, or 4/5, sorry, 5 strings, 4/5, if it's too small, the low string really well. If it's too large, the high string will break all the time. If you step either the D or the high E string as a D, you can actually have, an instrument on which the strings won't be problematic all the time. And you can play a lot of repertoire actually in that way.
Yeah, and maybe even just to add to this, the treatises in France in the 1780s were mentioning this as the tuning at the beginning of the century, this C, G, E, A, D. So that seems to have carried on a lot longer. Yeah. Like labor.
Yeah, I think that's the more, yeah. Yeah, even the late 18th century treatises that talk about the early 18th century cello still give that high D as the general string. And, you know, it makes a lot of sense because then you have the upper two strings being exactly the same as the bass gamba. Yeah. And you can actually, again, you know, share some repertoire between five-string cello and bass gamba, especially when you think that in some areas like northern Germany with people like Graun and Abel, who played both instruments as virtuoso soloists and could actually work on either instrument, it's probably a help to have at least two strings that are tuned in the same way.
Yeah.
You never know.
And so, well, thanks for the little side trip to the Bononcinis. Do you want to say anything about this new book about Naples, about the project? Your article is a big part of it. Yeah.
Right. It's actually a book that, again, was the result of a study day a couple of years ago in Naples, where we gathered to talk about, you know, could Naples have been the cradle of the cello? And that's pretty much what we ended up realizing, these things that I've mentioned there too. So the book was edited then out of the 5 talks that were given at that study day. And Dinko Fabris, the editor, asked me to sort of do a little bit what I'd done in that presentation, which was sketch an overview of the development of the cello in Italy, what I just did. So it's an almost 100-page long article where everything I said in our conversation here is actually in that article in much more detail. So it's really a reconsideration of what we call the Baroque cello, based on all these elements that I've mentioned. So it's not one standardized instrument, but 2 groups of cellos with different ways of tuning the instrument with different numbers of strings, 4, 5, or 6, held in all kinds of different ways, on the floor, between the legs, on the lap, sometimes even on the shoulder, with mainly underhand bow and sometimes overhand bow, especially in Naples and in France and England as a consequence of that. And starting in the late 18th century then with the classical cello, the Neapolitan cello, if you wish, So I basically go through all that, and I finish with a few considerations about what I call a 21st century aberration, which is the violoncello da spalla, as it has developed in the last 15 years and is based on a couple of anachronisms and historical falses. So the instrument has its value, but not as a historical performance practice instrument, basically.
I didn't really eat lunch yet today, so I don't know if I have the stomach to get into this conversation because it's really not one of my favorites.
This could be for another occasion.
We can, it's always a topic that interests people. So, I'm going to definitely host more events and invite you many times. So I hope we'll keep going.
My pleasure.
Was there anything left in your PowerPoint? I sort of interrupted you. Do you want to show anything else or keep talking or shall I? Yeah.
There is plenty more and a lot of
hours and hours.
Examples of repertoire. I can sort of go back very briefly and then we should probably adjourn and leave other things for the question and answer moment. Yeah. So let me go back to this. So here I just mentioned a few composers that wrote music that is interesting for bass violins. Giovanni Paolo Cima, Castello, and Fontana I've mentioned, but there are also plenty of pieces by Biagio Marini, Girolamo Frescobaldi, Buonamente, Selma y Salaverde, pieces not written then for bassoon, but for basso, any bass instrument, just like Vincenzo Bonizzi, of which we heard an example. Then if we go into later, So Bonizzi here, see that publication?
Yeah.
Alcune opere di diversi autori per la viola bastarda. Again, the viola bastarda is not really an instrument as much as it is a function and a way of developing a repertoire. This is 1626, not 28, as I said early. And you can see here, Piece ne peut venir, by Thomas Créquillon, 16th century composer. You see already, it starts in mezzo-soprano clef, goes to tenor clef, soprano clef here. Well, that's the bass line, sorry. But then goes into bass clef in the second line, goes to the low B flat here, and later on even down all the way to low G's. Here is a low G, for instance. But then you have all these 32nd and 16th notes here. So pretty much this highly virtuoso music that we heard in the first example I played. Then in Bologna, we have a number of composers, some of whom I've mentioned, Vitali, Colombi, Gabrielli, who are mostly active between Bologna and Modena, Iacchini, who was Gabrielli's student, Domenico Galli, who was more in Piacenza, and Modena. Perti, who was a composer in San Petronio, but wrote quite a few pieces that include solo cello, and he was probably a cellist himself. The Bononcinis, and then Vandini, who comes out of that Bolognese tradition, but then ends up working in Padova with Tartini, and even in Venice around Vivaldi. They probably never met, but then, sorry. This is superimposition of recordings.
Yeah.
So I'll skip the Degli Antoni bits here. And then we have a number of other composers where you find interesting bass lines. I'll just leave it on for a second. People who want to come back to that can actually look at it in the PowerPoint and pause it. And then in Naples, of course, we have first Rocco Greco with his sonate a due viole. And as I mentioned, viola in Naples definitely means bass violin. They actually are probably pieces for two bass instruments anyway. Then we have other composers like Niccolò Fiorenza, who was a violinist. Here you see he wrote 5 concertos for the cello, 1728. We have, this is the manuscript of the bass part with the continuo line, the cello part, solo part with the continuo line underneath. We have a concerti by Leonardo Leo in the 30s, which are, again, 5 concertos, fabulous pieces. And then we have probably the earliest real cellist in Naples, who is Supriani, erroneously often called Cipriani because of that transcription of the name here by the 19th century author. But here you see this sonata, which has 3 parts. You get the bass line, you get a simplified bass line, and you get an ornamented bass line. And each of these sonatas, 2 pages long. This was, again, a bit of a superimposition, but that was Elinor actually playing.
I was like, that's nice.
Supriani.
Oh yeah, that's such beautiful music. I'm amazed that all of it hasn't really been recorded fully, and definitely a project for the future. And
yeah, there's certainly much Neapolitan music that still needs recording. You know, people have done a few concertos of Fiorenza.
Yeah, nice.
Besma has recorded the 5 concertos for Leonardo Leo, but
Yeah.
all the Suprianis have not been recorded. There is a recording of the Pergolesi Sonata by several cellists, Gaetano Nasillo,
Yeah.
who has done
Yeah, it's
a
coming.
recording of Neapolitan music too, with Giulio Ruvo and so forth.
Yeah.
So we start to have a little better knowledge of that music, but it's, you know, still on its way. And the odd thing is, again, it's there that we have the origin, in that repertoire that we have the true origin of the modern cello.
Yeah.
Not in the Bolognese, because there we have different kinds of instruments.
Yeah.
So, you know, we can go on about this for a long time, but I think we can leave some for the question and answer session.
Yeah, and it just reminds me to say that, you know, we've been talking mostly about Italian music, but of course there's tons of French music not recorded, and there's lots of repertoire from all of Europe, maybe performed a little, recorded once or whatever, but there's a lot more work for cellists to do and to participate in this exploration that, you know, you've been spearheading and leading and exploring for a while. And I think everyone should join us and just keep going, because there's just much more to do.
Oh,
so
absolutely.
I find it exciting. Yeah.
Yeah, and actually, you know, I'm not the only one who's been doing this research. There is also a very recent book that is really spectacular by Bettina Hoffmann.
Yeah.
That just came out a few months ago, I Bassi d'Arco di Antonio Vivaldi. I have the title here, where she doesn't only talk about Vivaldi, but talks about double bass and cello and viola da gamba. There you go, which she really digs into a lot of material that has never been published. Yeah. And the first 100 pages of her book is also about the history of the instrument, of the term, the repertoire in Italy and outside Italy. So
fantastic.
The only disadvantage for the wider scholarly community is that it's in Italian, but whoever reads Italian, it's definitely one of the fundamental resources we have today for the cello in Italy. And the nice thing too is that we've done our research in very independent ways, and we seem to agree on most elements. So that's always comforting. Also, the work that has been done by musicologists in Rome, for instance, that has pretty much the same results. It's interesting to see that these reconsiderations we started from the beginning of this conversation, that the reconsiderations of the cello as an instrument in the Baroque period, we're pretty much on the same line in terms of research results. And I think it's time for all Baroque cellists to step away from the classical cello and go back to the instrument. It doesn't mean you have to buy 17 different instruments. If you have a smaller 5-string instruments, if you have a smaller 5-string instruments that can be used as a 4-string, and then a larger instrument with a set of 2 bridges that you can use as a 4 and a 5-string, respectively smaller and larger than a cello by a couple, 3 inches at the most, either way, and you can pretty much approach all the repertoire and learn the flexibility that is needed from any bass player of the Baroque period who is interested in bass violin instruments.
Great. Well, I think we will have more questions and thoughts in about 4 days. And so I'm going to sign off and stop the recording. And so thank you so much, Marc. It's been fascinating, and I hope we do it again.
My pleasure. And we'll see you at the Q&A.